Metal Gear Survive isn't as bad as most people make it out to be, but it's still pretty bad. So here are a few of my gripes. Before we even talk about gameplay, one of the game's biggest flaws can be seen right in the title: Metal Gear Survive. The reason that this is such a big problem stems from the game's creator, Konami. If you're unaware, Konami has been slowly shifting its focus away from console titles and into mobile games. And in doing so, they caused a lot of friction between them and the game creators they employed. This friction eventually caused some of those creators to move on from Konami. The bigger ones being Koji Igarashi, the man who helped solidify the Metroidvania genre, and the more relevant Hideo Kojima, who is the creator of the Metal Gear series. Kojima's departure means that Metal Gear Survive isn't benefiting from his creative vision, and this hurts it in a lot of ways. Metal Gear Survive's story starts at the end of Metal Gear Solid 5 Ground Zeroes, right after Mother Base gets attacked by the XOF. But instead of following Big Boss, we follow one of the soldiers left behind, who narrowly avoids getting sucked into another dimension, just to end up forced there by a secret government organization anyway. This other dimension, named Dite, is filled with poisonous dust and various zombie-esque beings called Wanderers, and your goal there is to survive and make it back to your own dimension. The story doesn't really suffer due to the outlandishness. After all, Phantom Pain had things like vocal cord parasites, a flaming man, and giant screaming robots. But rather, it suffers from its lack of decent character development and its constant and unnecessary nods to Metal Gear Solid 5. Take, for instance, this segment in the early game where you must go save a nurse who has been pulled through one of the portals. This nurse isn't just any ordinary nurse, though. You find out she worked for the Dakalia SBA Memorial Hospital in Cyprus, the very same hospital that Big Boss is treated at and eventually escapes from at the beginning of Metal Gear Solid 5. This fact serves no purpose other than to reference Metal Gear Solid 5, and it also has no bearing on the story of Metal Gear Survive. It just seems to have been included just for the sake of being included. Story aside though, most of my gripes come from the gameplay. There are effectively three different parts to Metal Gear Survive's gameplay. There's the survival aspect, where you use materials and the game's pseudo-currency Kuban energy to make food, equipment, build up your base, and manage your skills and other survivors. There's exploration, where you roam the dust and wanderer-filled wastes of Dite looking for resources, other survivors, and treasure. And the wave-based defense segments, where you protect something, usually an energy digger, while fighting off hordes of wanderers. Most of my gripes stem from the latter two of exploration and wave defense. The worst part of exploration is the resource gathering. Every part of looting seems to try and take up as much of your time as possible. Konami leaves large stacks of resources on shelves, making you pick up these items one by one. Looting containers or harvesting energy from enemies are accompanied by lengthy unskippable animations, and opening chests would be fine if it was just a minigame, but a lockpicking animation is tacked on with it. Of these though, enemy harvesting is the worst. The reason being that Kuban energy is needed in large quantities for leveling your character, so you need to get as much of it as you can. And enemies provide the bulk of that energy, but encountering a big horde of enemies and trying to loot all of them is such a chore, especially given the fact that you have limited time you can spend out in the dust areas. And as an extra slap on the face, there are skills to help you loot faster, but the difference is either extremely minimal or very situational. And the fact that you should have to acquire a skill to make the game less tedious is a real problem. Though this problem likely arises due to Konami's shift to a more mobile-centric company, because there is the option to purchase boosters, which increase the amount of energy you receive, meaning you need to spend less time looting. My gripe with the wave defense segments is the way it encourages you to use only one tactic. That tactic is putting down a fence or barrier, then dispatching all the wanderers that try and take it down. Even in the late game, where you have access to various traps and mounted weapons, it's still more cost-effective to use fences. And these fights get even more stale since those waves only ever include 2 different wanderer types until you get to the very late game. Another one of my gripes comes from a mechanic that has a very conflicted identity in this game, and that's the stealth mechanic. Now, stealth is a big part of the Metal Gear franchise, and Metal Gear Survive makes use of it despite being of a different genre. Konami just doesn't use it in a way that makes any real sense. You're introduced to stealth very early in the game, it functions the same as it does in Metal Gear Solid 5, and there are decent benefits to using stealth. By making use of it, you can avoid getting attacked by large groups of enemies, you can silently backstab wanderers, letting you take out small clusters one at a time, and the stronger mortar enemies can only be backstabbed if done from complete stealth, which eliminates the need for wasting stronger weapons to fight them head-on. And all these backstabs let you Fulton wanderers instead of harvest them, which grants you 50% more energy. But while these are all great incentives to utilize stealth, for some reason, Metal Gear Survive also tries to discourage you from using stealth. The act of crouching and crawling all costs stamina, meaning that you can only use stealth in short bursts. This is especially bad in the dust areas where all stamina drains at a much higher rate. And using stealth to simply sneak by wanderers doesn't make much sense when the energy they have is so necessary, and during the wave defense segments, stealth is a non-viable option as all the wanderers charge straight towards your defense target, regardless of whether they know you're there or not. And even if you did try to backstab them all, there would just be too many to do both that and effectively defend. My last few gripes are more about the game in general. Take the game's difficulty curve, which looks something like this. The beginning of the game is extremely hard. You have little food, no resources, your weapons suck and are extremely limited in their types, and you die in just a few hits. And this goes on for quite a while, but then you hit this portion of the game, and it's really where Metal Gear Survive shines. It starts about the time you first enter the jungle area. You have just enough food and water that you don't feel the need to hunt constantly. You can make decent weapons, but can't build a lot of the stronger ones, and a bunch of new enemies start being introduced, finally shifting away from just seeing the normal wanderers. And then you realize that this is the shortest segment of the game, where it ends not too long after, and by that point you've hit the last part of the curve where you suddenly have enough food and more resources than you know what to do with. The post-game doesn't really do anything to fix this either. At best, you're introduced to the random high-level bosses, which are interesting, but the rewards they give you hardly make fighting them worth it. And to even take them on, you need much higher level equipment, which you'll only get by grinding the base defense mode or the multiplayer wave defense modes, and grinding doesn't do much to make the game any more fun. Metal Gear Survive, as part of its survival genre, includes various different meters for things like hunger, thirst, stamina. These meters aren't my problem though. After all, many survival games have something of this nature. My gripe is rather the constant reminders you get when they hit a certain threshold.
Keep an eye on your remaining oxygen. Pay attention to your stamina. Your life has dropped.
Coupled with the fact that the game has no option to remove them makes them incredibly aggravating. It wouldn't even be that bad if these reminders weren't also followed by explanations on how to deal with them. I know how to refill my oxygen. I knew after the first time I was told. And there's also microtransactions. I already touched a bit on this with the resource boosters, but it's more than just that they sell. Microtransactions are also used to bypass the base defense delay timer. Base defense is one of the ways you get good loot during the post-game, but Konami adds a 24-hour delay between waves, preventing you from getting the higher rank rewards, which of course pushes you to pay to bypass that timer. You'll also need to pay if you want more exploration teams, which is Metal Gear Survive's method of acquiring energy and resources by sending out your survivors instead of going out yourself. You can also buy a booster for a team to temporarily increase the amount of resources they can recover, and if for whatever reason you want your team to return early, you guessed it, you need to pay for that feature as well. The only other thing you can pay for is buying a second avatar. I can't really say what the benefit of that would be since they share resources and such, but the option's there nevertheless. All these microtransactions, forced waiting periods, and boosters just scream mobile game, and that makes it really hard to enjoy Metal Gear Survive when it keeps acting like one instead of being the console game that it is. The last thing I want to mention isn't so much a gripe so much as it's just a problem. Metal Gear Survive takes a lot from Metal Gear Solid 5. The game engine, bits of the story, and even certain game mechanics. And that's really not so bad. Metal Gear Solid 5 was a great game after all. The problem is that Metal Gear Solid 5 and Metal Gear Survive are different genres of games. Metal Gear Solid 5 is an action stealth game, and Metal Gear Survive is a survival defense game. These two shouldn't be compared with each other quite so heavily, but when Konami uses so much of Metal Gear Solid 5 that you're given no choice but to compare them, it's hard not to see Metal Gear Survive as just a watered-down version of Metal Gear Solid 5 that doesn't have a bunch of cool gadgets, different ways of approaching every level, and heart-pounding stealth action. So much so that even the good parts of Metal Gear Survive are often overshadowed by that comparison. Konami, instead, should have taken a step back and changed a lot more of this game, so that it functions as an interesting spin-off that's only about as related to the Metal Gear series as Metal Gear Rising was.